Some of you know me as Shlosh, the others know me as Stu. I want to first of all thank Rabbi Haber for the whole reason this is happening, because we had this social event a while back. I remember how long ago, and Rabbi Haber said, we should be using this building for different things. We should be bringing the rule of this building. And if I said that, I feel like it wouldn't be real. But it says that I totally believe it when they're all said it. And he asked people to sign up for different things. And so he said, what about we should have like speakers bureau, speakers events? A few people signed up, and we've been working on it. I just first of all want to mention them too, because I just happen to be the one standing here, but I want to thank Pinchas, Ilya, Yechiel, Chaim Stadelman, and also Dan Weiss, who sort of is like our connection to the board. You need to have like, it's like in Washington, D.C., they have like a person who goes to the Senate. It's hush. Don't ask if we only details. And I want to also thank, of course, Rav Judah Mischel for agreeing to come. It's not like people, like he doesn't have what to do. Let's just say I read his bio. But first of all, I searched. I said I don't really have to do a thing introduction. So I did a search for him. I read a lot about it from I know a lot about it. And he won't let me read any of that. He said, look, I should do it already. That's what he said. I'm quoting him. But he showed me the thing in the back of the book, which I also would like to really highlight, because this was sweeping the Jewish world. It was really hell of a time. Put up by our beloved Mosaic, and being sold at a discount in the back. And you can bid. So if you don't have to catch it, no problem at all. And of course, I'm sure that the author will be gracious enough to sign the book. I think. And it's always good to buy books. I'm a book policy for a profession, and the books are saving the world. Jewish people who live on books, so buy books. Okay, so now to our speaker. So, Rabbi Mischel. First of all, I just want to say one thing. Like, I know nothing. We've never met really. We met a little bit, but I know one thing. He's an executive director of Camp HASC, and any person I know who's been involved in that camp, it's like a cult, but a good cult. If you try to deprogram people from it, they won't. They want to go back the next summer. First, you have to get accepted. It's not such a word here. And we have a guy involved. We have sort of like advised by us. When he comes, he says, "Hi, the shop," and he runs around meeting all his friends from HASC for a big show. It's obviously very important HESED organization that helps campers with special needs. So he's the executive director of Camp HASC. He's the mashpia of the open NCSY division, NCSY is pretty world. And he and his wife founded, I think it's true to say, you and your wife did, Sama Nafshi, which is an organization dedicated to Jewish education. And he's a Talmud Rav of Avraham Tzvi, and he taught at Reshit. It's called Reshit in Yerushalayim, but it's in Beit Shemesh. So Frisch, which is Paramus, which is Vernon County, I can attest. And so we're thrilled to have him here, and glad there's a message nice to have. He didn't come for me as alternate over in the week.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much. For not knowing each other, that was Suburban County is a wonderful horse. That's true. I did great with that. Osios Machkilos, if anybody would like. Shavua Tov, everyone. Goodbye. Very, very special to be here. Shows behavior, such extraordinary hakaras hatov from behavior. Do you have to use this? Please do. One here. Well, you didn't mention that I got for tidbits. That's the main thing. Oh, I'm using the mic. There we go. I'm using the microphone. You can't hear it. Mention for tidbits. Rishus Harav Haber, from close and from far for a very, very, very long time. A role model, teacher, I'm indebted to, and incredible Carson that they've enabled, made family. To all the wonderful members of this great Kehillah. I mean, this is not what a general Motzei Shabbos looks like for me. By this time, after Shabbos, the toys are away, and some of the dishes have symbolically been done. I'm already in sweatpants by the table on to the next thing. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to be out about Motzei Shabbos. Usually out and about the Motzei Shabbos, at least in the previous Gilgul, meant bowling a pizza, and now the last 25 years we've been thinking about bowling a pizza. So it's nice to be here. Who has shiurim on Motzei Shabbos? That's yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's fun. It's cool. Yeah, it's fun. I feel like a little bit like intimidated, but I feel like it's coming at me.
It's much less intimidating. So.
Yeah, it's fun. But I will say that to have a Kehillah, a community where learning on Motzei Shabbos, coming together for Motzei Shabbos is a thing, it's even a Havamina, that's an extraordinary testament to the type of community that this is. So it's a great privilege to be here. It's just the Rav, the father. Motzei Shabbos, there's a custom, there's many Israel to share stories of tzaddikim. Probably that developed in the generation after Baal Shem Tov. And to remember what it was like to be in his presence. And for us, on Motzei Shabbos, when the consciousness on Shabbos is expanded, we feel good, we're rested, we're eating well, we're davening in a different way, we feel our best selves, we're dressed in a different way. There's a certain bigness in our lives that we tap into, that Mishal Yisera comes Motzei Shabbos, and then we kind of have those the Saturday night blues. So we tell stories of tzaddikim to kind of see a bigger picture of what a person can be. Think a little bit about how we can be and tap into that expansiveness. One day when Baal Shem Tov came out of his Beis Medrash in Meshbez, he was with his chaver, they were standing around him there, and they saw a chaykel, the local Wasserträger, the local water schlepper. His name was Chaykel because you can't call him Mischel because it would be too obvious that we're just picking a name out of a hat and calling him Mischel. Mischel was probably the wood shopper, perhaps the tailor, but this happened to be in Meshbez. At that time, Chaykel was that specific by Wasserträger. You shouldn't think we're just picking up names arbitrarily. Anyways, Chaykel was generally a positive, smiling guy. That day he happened to be particularly looked like something was wrong. And as he walked past, like wasn't a little bit down, Baal Shem Tov said to him, "Hey, Chaykel, what's going on? You look like what happened? You all right? You're down." And he said, "Oh, Rabbi, you can't see worse. Be careful what's going on. These Jews, the Gemir culture, they're building houses on top of the hill now. They expanded up the block, Tom's River. They this whole new area up here, and you can't believe how big these houses are. And now instead of just schlepping water down the regular area in Meshbez, I gotta go all the way up to Jackson and schlep this water here. It's impossible. The hills are steep. I'm not getting any younger. My back is killing me, and the route is circuitous. Barely like a parnasa. It's like whatever. I'll tell you, things are really tough, and it's just I don't know, whatever. Really, really down." Baal Shem Tov looked at him and said, "I'm sorry, Chaykel, I hope things get better for you." He said, "No, Rebbe, whatever." And just continued on his way. Well, Talmidim kind of felt bad. Like this guy is having a really rough go. The next day they're coming out of Shabbos again. And sure enough, here comes Chaykel. The Chaykel's got the two buckets of water over his back, the pole there, schlepping. This time he's got a little bit of a jump in his step, and he's smiling, and he sees the Baal Shem Tov coming, and he says, Rebbe, good morning, guten Tag. And Baal Shem Tov says, good morning, what's going on? He says, Chaz Hashem. What is supposed to be alive? I have a job. What a covet to be able to bring water. I'm going to bring water up the hill today. Life is full of good challenges. I feel healthy. I feel strong. I'm going to bring water to Jews to wash Nagelwasser and to cook with. Rebbe, what is supposed to be a year? Thank God. Chaz Hashem. And he continued on his way. And the Talmidim kind of like looked at Baal Shem Tov, like, was this the same guy? Is this like, I don't know if they have a DSM, is it multiple personality? What's the story with this guy? Is this the same Chayku we saw yesterday? It looks like two totally different people. Baal Shem Tov turned to this discovery and he said, you might think that there's two Chaykus, but really there's just one, it's the same guy. And know this, listen carefully. You might think that yesterday Chayku had a bad day. And because he had a bad day, he was tzibroch, he was broken, he was down. He was downcast, he was sad. And today, he's having a good day. Today's a good day, so he's happy. You have to know that by Yidden, for us, they're not good days and bad days. There are times when a Jew chooses to see good and to be happy. And there are times when a Jew chooses to not. There are times where that are opportune, where the flow, where the setting enables us to have the ability to choose, to be good, to feel good, to focus on what's going right. And there are times where we choose not to. But every day is a day that expresses Ratzon Hashem, and every day is an opportunity to be the simcha. The Gemara Tanis tells us, and that's these days that we're in. If you have a sheet in front of you, it's good. You have to look inside. But the letters, there's something to them. In the same way that we learned that when we enter the month of Av, there's a lessening of simcha. So too, or so, when we enter Adar, we're marvin the simcha. I always imagine this like in my grandmother's house, in the dining room, she had one of the switches, not like we had, we turn them on and off, not an on and off switch, but there was like this, the mood dimmer. Like Thanksgiving, I always have like the memory of like standing there in my grandparents' house, like going with this in the living room, making it on, waking up, and my grandfather yelling at me, cut it out, just sit down, let it go, let it be, you're gonna make a fire. I don't know if that's true. Well, that's true in engineering, but you're gonna make a fire, put it down. So put it down, put it up, put it down. When you enter into the month of Av, there's a time where there's something happening in the atmosphere, there's something happening in the environment, the time of churban, the time of godless, the time of distance, alienations, the time of darkness in the world. This is what's happening in the setting. It's kind of like an away game. And we're mamatim b'simcha. It's kind of a de-emphasis on joy. And when we come into other marvin b'simcha, suddenly we start, we start putting on little funny hats and making noises and marvin b'simcha, however that expresses it. The first Motzei Shabbos of Adar, I thought to spend a little bit of time together focusing on the avoda of simcha, the working of simcha, the choice of simcha, the opportunity to choose, the opportunity to look in the direction of the time period that we're in, and to learn from what the Baal Shem Tov said about Chaykel, no matter how much water we're schlepping, to choose a mindset of being b'simcha. It's hard to think about this topic without talking about Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman of Breslev writes about the avoda of simcha and addresses the avoda of simcha more accurately, maybe more so than any other of the popular works of contemporary Jewish thought. A lot about the avoda of simcha. One might say that it's because autobiographically it's a person who struggled with the avoda of simcha. Often somebody was asked like, not so many people ask like, why are you writing about Shuvah for? I'm like, They say, paraphrasing, the gangster life, I didn't choose the gangster life. The gangster life chose me, a person who's thinking with and struggling with tshuva and trying to rectify and repair the relationship with Hashem, and thinking about it all the time, making up for things I fell short. So put a lot of thought and effort into writing about tshuva. So Rabbeinu was talking a lot about simcha. One of the first books I ever read, introduced Rabbi Nachman to Melon Wiesel, the four Hasidic masters and the struggle with melancholy. There's a chapter in there, without talking too much from the outside, just learning anything about Rabbi Nachman. He was a person who was working very, very hard and struggling very, very much to stay positive and to choose positive. The truth is, the avoda of midah, specifically of simcha, as long as we see it's across the board. Lubavitcher Rebbe is probably the most recognizable rabbinic figure in the generation. His face is, for better, is all over the place. It's kind of like Lubavitcher Rebbe, like almost like a Mickey Mouse. Okay? Everywhere you go, there's a picture of the Rebbe. For better and for better. The Rebbe was like the most known public figure. He spent decades and decades out there in front of a crowd. The Rebbe originally was really like a recluse. He was somebody who was an introvert. But in order to fulfill the role that destiny and history and shkacha overcame that midah, he worked through that midah of being someone who was really very quiet and put himself out there for the sake of the Jewish people. Likewise, the Rebbe said about himself, he was somebody who was filled with Morish Torah. He was somebody who was not like a very, positive and light, freilich personality. Very heavy and serious and almost dark. His father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, was someone who was a people person, light, but he felt himself drawn down, struck by gravity and by his personality. He said there was a real avoda to be somebody who became this positive personality, who embraced joy and optimism, and then turned himself literally into somebody who became a public personality. Similarly, Chaim Brisk, Chaim Soloveitchik. Chaim Brisk, who was known as the most generous person of his generation, well before Machlis, he was asking about his own home, that it was Rishus HaRabim. It was like if somebody left something there, the sign hanging in his living room, that this living room was not a Rishus HaYachid, but this is called the public domain. People dropped off children by the doorstep there to take care of them. His children said that they wouldn't know if they would have a bed to sleep in because all sorts of people were sleeping. He was the greatest Talmudic mind of his generation. He wanted on his tombstone to say, Rav Chesed. He was a person who was committed to Chesed. But he said that to become somebody who was generous and giving, he had to break himself. People think he wrote about himself that I'm a good guy. I'm like an easy good guy. So but every time he had to open his hand and give a coping, he said to break himself. There's an avoda to become that generous person. There's an avoda to become that person who's associated as a person who's besimcha. Look at the Eitzot, it says, Lazakos l'simcha, to merit being besimcha, zekashe v'kaved yoter mishar kol avodah. It's more difficult, more challenging, it's heavier than all the other avodas. The Rebbe says, if do as Hashem besimcha. There's an avoda of simcha, requires work and effort. Therefore, Rabbi Nachman says, sometimes we have to force ourselves. With all of our strength, with all different types of advice and insight. I don't know, maybe this means a reference to self-help books. Maybe this is a reference to podcasts. I don't know. This is a reference to getting a trainer and reading books about optimism. I don't know, but anything in order for a person, to always be in a state of simcha. He says, no matter what you have to do, even if it means milsa the shtusa, telling a good joke and making narishkeit and slapstick comedy, physical comedy, different things that just kind of lighten the mood and break ourselves out of our heaviness and the gravitational pull. When we daven, Shabbos, Yontif, mitzvah gadol lios b'simcha tamid. This is one of the sources in Breslov. What is this? Mitzvah gadol lios b'simcha tamid. It's not in the Rambam or the Ramban or the Smag's counting of mitzvahs, nor is it the Chofetz Chaim's little. But Rabbi Nachman says mitzvah gadola lios b'simcha tamid. It's a great mitzvah to always be b'simcha. It was heaviness and negativity, sadness by choosing, so to speak, the first day of cycle. Ein Yodin Mishmo, Nachman says. It's like we lose sight of God's name. We don't know from God's name. It's a very powerful imagery and language. We consider the different ways that Hashem, the Kodesh Baruch Hu, so to speak, relates to the Avos, and then Shmitz Moshe Rabbeinu throughout the narrative of our descent from Mitzrayim. Shmi Havaya L'Nodati Lahem. The way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself to Klal Yisrael, the generations, is by revealing different aspects of himself through his different names. The notion of God's name, being called through us identifying with Hashem's name, and having that sense of closeness, we see in the prophets as well. This language of Nachman is really borrowed from the Nevi'im. Yirmiyahu Navi, one of the more tragic figures, one of the more painful figures in Jewish history, the prophet of Doom, the prophet of the Chorban, someone who never married, and someone who was very alone in the world, rejected by his peers, listened to him. Not only that, rebelled against him, spat at him, stoned him, imprisoned him, and the worst possible thing is that everything that he said was he said, "I told you so." Just imagine that pain, being the prophet of the Chorban, Echa. Yirmiyahu Navi, it could be that this is where Rabbeinu Nachman borrowed this language. And Yirmiyahu Navi says that in the midst of all of this suffering, personal and national, in the midst of having to be this messenger of the Jewish people, it says, cries out to Ribbon Shalom in a moment of what seems to be exhaustion, it seems to be frustration. And you know, completely like, remember me. Just have my back, remember me. Stand up for yourself in the world. The embarrassment and the degradation that I'm suffering on behalf of you. Just remember me. Avenge your name and your reputation. Nonetheless, with all of this difficulty and pain, all of this challenge, your word, the privilege of carrying your message, your prophecy to Klal Yisrael, is a source of sason and simcha. In my heart, I carry joy because of the privilege to be the one to deliver your message. Ki nikra shimcha alai Hashem Elokei Tzavaot. Because your name is called through me. I'm filled with joy. I might have failed at this mission to convince the people and awaken them in Shuvah. I might be suffering degradation, humiliation, imprisonment, and everything from the people that I'm here serving and also nefesh for. Nonetheless, Yirmiyahu was b'simcha. Because that's the Rebbe explains that this is how he was able to have prophecy at a time before, during, and after Korban and bring out the message of Eicha. Because of his sense of self and mission, sense of purpose in the world, and the fact that he understood that the Ribbon Shalom was with him, that God was calling for him, gave his life purpose and meaning, and a cause to be the simcha. There was nothing external that could take away that simcha. There was nothing that caused that simcha externally, and there's nothing that could be removed that would take away that simcha. The notion of God calling through us, of us recognizing that we're in Hashem's presence, and that seeing Hashem before us and being seen by the Ribbon Shalom, so to speak, is really like the beginning point. It's really the lens, the frame, the starting point through which we begin our understanding of our daily practice of what it is to be Yid, how to live like a Jew. And it's really the key, so to speak, to unlock this avodah kasha, the Kveda that Nachman says, this heavy, difficult working of simcha. The very first opening of Shulchan Aruch, the beginning of the Torah Jewish law, the first step in how to live like a Jew. You wake up in the morning, Shulchan Aruch tells us, we wake up in the morning, avodas boro, the service of our Creator, to serve our Creator. Talk about that means that we begin by recognizing that we are in the service of God. Thank God for the opportunity to be in His service. The very first comment that the Ramah, Moshe Israel, the very first comment that the Ramah makes about what it is to live like a Jew, he quotes from Pasuk in Tehillim. First things first. God is before me always. And I said before me always. Shivisi. First things first. We want to live like a Jew, to know what it means, what the key is to living with God consciousness, so that everything that we do throughout our day is framed by that mission. Set before Hashem always. To know that I'm in Hashem's presence, that I'm seeing Hashem and being seen by Hashem constantly. Says the Ramah, Shivisi Hashem called Go Torah. This is a foundational idea of Torah. V'malos hatzadikim, and the levels that to help us ascend toward righteousness. Asher holchem l'fnei Elokim, those who walk before God. In yeshivas ha'adam also whether we're sitting at home by ourselves or we're out there in the workforce, wherever we are in public or in private, has to be understood and lived and experienced through the prism of recognizing that we are constantly in God's presence. So Shivisi Hashem he paints a very vivid picture here as an introduction to the code of Jewish law. I recognize that the difference between the Melech, Malchi, and Lachim, the infinite God, and the God of Basar Adam, that Hashem is Meloch Lord's Kavodo, and Hashem is only Allah, Hashem is always constantly with us, watching us, the Roed Masa, and recognizing that Hashem is always with us, and we're constantly in His presence, should fill us with a sense of achna'ah and yira, of humility and of recognition, of awareness before God, of submission before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was with us talking. Now, the Vilna Gaon explains that this is not just like one of the elements of being a person who lives with righteousness. This is not among the virtues, but this is the defining virtue. This is the cornerstone. This is the key to it all. The foundation for all of Yiddishkeit, of living with Yirat Shamayim, living in the presence of God, is Shivisi. Not one of, but the. Shivisi Hashem l'negdi samim. Hashem explains that Shivisi, this what David HaMelech describes as this being in the presence of God. Shivisi comes from the language of hishtavus, equanimity, shaveh. Things are equal. Shiviti is a shaveh. Things are equal. In other words, whether I'm in public or in private, where things are going well or things are not going well, whether I'm having a hard time schlepping my buckets up the hill, or have somebody helping me, or have a lift, or whatever. That day it's easier. Regardless, shaveh. There's a sense of equanimity and peace. Because I recognize that whether it's a little bit more difficult, a little bit harder, whether I feel close or I feel far, whether the dial on the dining room wall is making the light a little bit stronger or a little bit less, whether there's more light or more darkness, more money or less money, whether he says yes or she says no, in sickness or health, rich or poor, it should only be for revealed good. Should you see? There's a certain equanimity and peace of saying, I'm here with the Shalom. Recognizing that we're always with God and God is always with us. This is Akol Me'ito Yisparach, the focus is from Hashem. This is a fulfillment of Shivisi Hashem, Unegdi Talmud. Even the Talmud of Hashem to explain when we sense that God is Lenegdi, maybe against me a little. Even if there's some sense of oppositional force here in my life, and things are not going the way I want them to or I intended them to, when I recognize that it's rooted in Ratzon Hashem, that Hashem is with me, there's a certain equanimity and peace that I can feel. Now it's an Hebrew year, it's a leap year. I was talking last night, we're talking about, okay, so not in yeshiva. I don't know how many people are in yeshiva and living with the Zman. Last night I was talking about the Zman of other, I'm looking around the room, I'm like anybody here is learning in yeshiva, everybody here is working, everybody here is like, different stages of life. He's in yeshiva, so he's talking about double other, yeshiva, keeping the bread through other. I'm like, I have that same challenge, but how do I keep that going for myself? Shenichnas other marvin b'simcha. It's an hybrid. Okay, so I'm trying to think like, okay, Zion other. I can make Moshe Rabbeinu's Yahrzeit, but that's next. Okay, Isaac's birthday is an other, but that's really next one. Okay, I got Shabbos Zachar, that's the next one. I'm trying like, how do we keep this theme going, and how do we make the time meaningful? In Yonah Diyama, we're in other Aleph. The Vilna Gaon juxtaposes this introductory comment of the Ramah, first introductory comment of the Ramah, with another synod in Orach Chaim and Shulchan Aruch, actually with the last synod in Orach Chaim and Shulchan Aruch. This Code of Jewish Law, Orach Chaim, the first section essentially is our day-to-day living, how to live like a Jew. The first comment of the Ramah and the last comment of the Ramah, the Vilna Gaon puts them together. Bookends, the Code of Jewish Law. The last synod in Shulchan Aruch and Orach Chaim is talking about what happens when we have an Hebrew year, when we have a leap year. We have a leap year. What happens with Purim? The Torah tells us that we celebrate Purim in the second Adar, and in the first Adar, on the 14th of the month, is a day known to us as Purim Katan. So what happens Purim Katan? Purim Katan, it's a Tachanun. We don't say Hespeda. Okay, so you can go down the block 5 minutes, and there's no, there's lots of Hespeda, but there's not necessarily Tachanun. Not necessarily Tachanun on a regular day. So the Ramah writes that there's a day that Yesh Omer, that there are those who say, they can look on the sheet, Shechayim, Laharbos, the Mishnah, Simcha, that there's some aspect of having a little bit extra joy on that day, and making a little bit Mishnah, Simcha, and we don't really mask in that way, but there's some who have that minute, it's a little bit whatever, if you want to, it's good. But maybe for the Machmirim, Yarbektsas, Besuda, Kedei Latzekin and Machmirim, because Tov Leiv Mishta Tovim. Because it's good for a person to always be in a state of celebration, of enjoying. Tov Leiv Mishta Tovim. It's good for the heart to be gladdened. The Gro used to bless his Talmidim, he used to bench his Talmidim and say that you should be Zocha to the Shnei Tamidim. It's a reference to the Shnei Tamidim, the daily sacrifices in the morning and the evening. Shnei Tamidim. Because you should be Zocha to the Shnei Tamidim. The first Tamid of the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, of Shivisi Hashem L'negdi Tamid, to know that God is before us always. And the last simon in Orach Chaim and Shulchan Aruch, we should be Zocha to Tov Leiv Mishta Tamid. To always be in a state of gladness, to always be a little bit ready, open, Sibala Masiba, open a little bit for a little bit of a party, to always be in a state of joy. To unite the equanimity of Shivisi with the constant joy of a Leiv Tov. The equanimity of Shivisi and the joy of a Leiv Tov, Tamid. Because mitzvah gadol lios b'simcha, Tamid. The joy of simply being alive. The joy of being a Jew. The joy of being who we are. It's a little bit clarifies what simcha is and also what it's not. Simcha is not the result of a peak achievement. It's not the result of some type of success. It's not the result or response to anything that comes from the outside, but it's inside out. A baseline choice of recognizing who we are, not what we do. Who we are and not what we have. Kishem shenichnas, the same way that when we come into Av, time of churban, alienation and distance, we keep our baseline of recognizing who we are. We don't lose ourselves. We don't lose ourselves in that churban. We hear the message of Yirmiyahu and Navi. We recognize God is called through us in distance, in those Yemei HaSinah. In the Yemei Ha'ava, like Rabbeinu Tam says, in the days of Adar, when there's a revealed good and there's this turnabout and this great, exciting, joyous revelation of the days of Mordechai and Esther, Marvin was sent. Juxtaposing these opposites, Churban and exile with a little bit of a taste of redemption, it shows that there's not good days and bad days. There's an opportune time where we can focus and choose revealed good, to focus on what's going right, of Marvin, and then also the opposite. Sometimes it helps when there's external validation. We do exile has worn us down a little bit. And sometimes when we hear from the outside, with the way they look at us, we can learn the days of Megillah. Paro calls us an Am, Yisro says Baruch Hashem, Haman is the Tzorei HaYehudin, like we learn sometimes from the outside. There's a very wise woman, the wise woman of our generation, the first American Tibetan nun. I mean, that's like a lot. I'm saying that's a lot. I don't know how many there are. Unlike most other Tibetan nuns, she wasn't born in But Heather Shadron, she's written dozens of books, and some of them are really very, very valuable. Very wise person. She writes this book called The Wisdom of No Escape. That happiness comes from developing practices that allow you to confront your thoughts. Happiness comes from developing practices that allow us to confront our thoughts, both the joyous ones and the painful ones. Shame, etc. Where we learn to live them in a way that's much healthier and less reactive. It means that our sadness and happiness, simcha, is not a reaction to something. We preserve happiness by living an organic life. Mitzvahs, becoming friends with our thoughts, makabel, hishtavus. Practices that allow us to preserve the spectrum of our emotional lives. We don't preserve happiness by chasing it. To us, if we take a step back and we consider how we live the rhythm of the Jewish calendar, it's just to us is very obvious. The Jewish heart is expansive. When we celebrate Chasna, we bring the less. We sing the highest moment of personal joy. When we build a beautiful home, we leave a little bit undone. We're able to hold the opposites. We're able to embrace dialect. We're able to maintain a textured view on the world and on reality. We're able to befriend, so to speak, distance and closeness at the same time. Shivisi Hashem l'neg b'samim. God dwells, God is before me always. God dwells before me always. The next pasuk is l'chein, therefore, samach libi v'yamel v'yagel k'chodi. Therefore, my heart rejoices. It was like there's a David Melech who went through it all. Who went through it all. When we're zooking to him, when we're saying to him the highest moments and the lowest moments, when we're crying to him and dancing to him. Instead of David Melech is pointing us to a very real truth here, something causational. That when we live with this notion of shivisi, of equanimity, so it's the product of a conscious choice to embrace the reality of whatever is in front of us, for good it may be, for revealed good, whether darkness or light, in sickness or health, right? But the recognition that God is always before me. Therefore, l'chein, because I recognize that it's with Hashem, from Hashem, before Hashem, l'chein samach libi. Therefore, I can be b'simcha. I'm not alone. I'm not alone. The Tzaddik teaches that b'simcha, the same letters as machshava. B'simcha is a choice of how we're going to frame, how we're going to see the situation, how we're going to live through it. One of the great modern paradigms of this way of living was the Klezmer Rebbe. Because you know, that sounds supposed to again later, Shabbat Chaim. Before the war, one of the great Rebbes, from Klezmer, Romania. His wife and 11 children died in the war, beyond comprehension of Islam. He went through every stage of Gehenna, self-described. Almost bled to death on march. He came out of the war and chose life and rebuilt. And throughout the Shabbat Chaim, I don't have all the volumes and haven't learned all the volumes, but I don't know, the few that I've read in the Shalosh Stories, especially in the Torah, you see a person who was desperately trying to pull himself out of immense darkness and grief, immense trauma. And lived through Churban and desperately trying to rebuild. And he did. In Union City, a whole Chassidus, and in Netanya, Laniara Hospital, and a worldwide network of Torah, of different Shas. He was a person who was demanding, a person who was very very rigid and like I say, insisting on greatness. My Rebbe was a house builder by the. He said living and being in the same place because he couldn't breathe. Rebbe demanded constantly that there be movement, that there be doing something. You could see that there was a person who was struggling deeply to maintain simcha. In the first few days after liberation in Farnball, there was an American chaplain who visited the Rebbe, and he asked him, Rebbe, the was fired. Right after the war, right away, Tashmish Kedusha, right away, and all of Esra, right away, and Svarim, right back to business, right there. So this American chaplain asked the Chazon Rebbe, do your Talmidim need anything? It was told they needed everything. They needed lots of stuff. They needed Svarim, they also needed food, they needed clothing, they needed everything. This rabbi asked the Chazon Rebbe, do your Talmidim need anything? The Rebbe wanted to make a point. He said, I've taught my Talmidim not to need anything. I've taught them not to need anything so that they naturally have everything they need. Because happiness is not something that we can achieve or attain or acquire by chasing it. If simcha is something which is a result of having something, then if we don't have it, we can lose it. There was a gut-wrenching and very powerful article in the New York Times a couple of years ago. I don't read the New York Times, don't get it. Don't get it. Don't read it. There was an article that was quoted. So I wanted to look it up. It's article. Well, until it wasn't. But there's a very no, it's working. There's an article called "Happiness Won't Save You" about the life and story of Philip Brickman. Philip Brickman was a social psychologist. Institute of Social Research in Michigan. He was one of the first to really think about and write about happiness. Before, I don't know, you can ask the Rav family, how many millions of books there are and podcasts about simcha. It's like the topic. I really read Sikorsky's book, The Best Future of Happiness. I can sit here and plug my own books and plug another Mosaic book, and then if we apply it, the algorithm will show up. This is the back. There's Brickman really was one of the first. And before Talmud Shachar, he was the one who really researched it. And he was a person who spent his entire life. He coined the term the hedonic treadmill, which is really like if any of the second and third generation Chevra who are writing about happiness in the last 40 years, they're all quoting that notion, they all kind of point out, which is like this recognition that we know, Yeshli Rabbi Katz wrote about it 25 years ago, Yeshli Rav, Yeshli Ko, but when this non-stop pursuit of stuff, of things, and accomplishments, thinking that we're going to acquire more, then be better, then I'll be happy. When I achieve this, then I'll be happy. When I get there, then I'll be happy. The notion that there's this moving goalposts in acquisition or accomplishment when it comes to this chase for happiness will lead us nowhere is called the hedonic treadmill. That's what he called it. He said that later in his life, he transitioned into a theory that he recognized that you can't chase happiness. We're never going to accomplish anything or achieve it by thinking we're going to have stuff. But he understood later in life, based on his data and his research, that happiness comes from commitments and contribution. That's it. Commitments and contribution. And having that a vehicle for real happiness means being committed to something, a cause, an ideology, a way of life. Something that I feel that I'm needed for, that I needed to, that I'm tethered to. And that my contribution to this relationship, to this institution, to this movement, to this practice, will ultimately be a vehicle of happiness. It's Motzei Shabbos Truma. I mean, this is what the last 2 weeks, after Matan Torah, this is the Ribbon Shalom already was mechaber to this a long time ago. Right away, we get Torah, and what does it mean to be a Jew? Living a Jewish life, we practice dozens and dozens of mitzvahs, commitments that we have to make in a very practical way, on a day-to-day level. Tamid, the Shnei Tamid, morning, afternoon, and night. We have obligations, we have commitments that we're called upon to do in the presence of God, because God is called through us. Shachos, Mincha, Mar, Kavod Shal Shachar, Kavod Shal Berabah, whatever it is, all day and night, and everywhere in between, A Jew has commitments that we live with. The building of the Mishkan, the construction is construction of a place, of a thing that manifests. That's called holiness. And that depends on the contribution of an individual. And the ceiling of the Mishkan is the Oros Techashim, the Saskodesh, the Sas V'Salach B'Panav. This min chaya, this animal that was created just for that specific time, as if to drive home the message to us. And we walk into shul, we walk into the Mishkan, we walk into the presence of God to recognize that just as this individual animal had its specific contribution that nothing else can do, and this throughout all of history, our shachris, our bracha chrona, our shayatzar, our couple of shkalim, our shahako miyabetvaro, our hafrashas chala, our Torah mitzvahs, our commitments and our contributions are unique, are important, are necessary, and that's what gives us a life of meaning, purpose, those commitments and that contribution. Tragically, Philip Brickman took his own life. Tragically. I'm not going to address mental illness, a person suffers from depression, but it's very clear, this article brought out very clear that it was one of the commitments in his own life unraveled. When he became untethered from his day-to-day commitments, his wife, his family, when he felt that his contribution professionally wasn't being appreciated by people in his machon. We saw that his articles weren't getting enough likes on Instagram or whatever it may be. It was the early 80s, but whatever that equivalent was, he unraveled. The key to a healthy and happy life is knowing who we are. He is created and how fortunate we are, how beautiful it is to recognize that we are soul, to recognize that we're created with purpose, and that Hashem needs us and wants us and counts on us, and that we are before God and with God always. Recognizing who we are is the first step to think about what we have to do in the world. Purpose and identity. What we do, our commitments, and our contribution, Torah and mitzvahs is the system that reveals us that second. First is who we are. Rav Judah Mischel explained just a beautiful shekel to kind of fill out the whole Golan's understanding. But the first topic is Shnei Tamidim. The first topic implies yira, a sense of awe, almost distance. Like even the Rama writes, Acha, Pusha, a sense of whoa, before the Rebbeinu Shalom. Reverence. That's a prerequisite for kind of entering into the mindset of what it means to be a Jew. Our daily observance, the recognizing, that what we have to do is living an organic Jewish life means living a life of doing, of being held accountable, of measuring, of keeping track of time, of learning halacha, of being careful of what we say, what comes out of our mouth, goes into our mouth, what we see, how we treat people, how we deal with money, our commitments, our contributions. There's a progression. Shnei Tamidim is also a progression. Because Yira, Shvisi Hashem Lechitamid, is really a gateway toward a life of commitment. Torah and mitzvahs observance, which results ultimately in a sense of Tov Mishnah Talmud, a sense of this is good, these obligations, it's kshmak, it's good to be. There's positivity, there's simcha. It fills my life with purpose and meaning. And the irony that the last of the halachas of Or Chaim is Purim Katan. It's a day that has no specific mitzvahs attached to it. No shlach manos, there's no Chris Megillah. There's not even a sense of boundlessness and going beyond ourselves. There's no chayim, and it's not like this whole day of celebration. There's no specific mitzvah. And it's dafka in that day that we learn the lesson of being in a state of simcha. So the two others, maybe are time for us to reflect on these Shnei Tamidim. And the first other, being devoid, so to speak, of any specific mitzvah that's attached to this Purim, the specific rubric of Simchas Purim, gives us pause to reflect a little bit on what it really means to be the Simcha. It's the Simcha of just being, Simcha of being alive, the privilege to be in God's presence without a commitment attached to it. The first things first, recognizing that totally is Mishnah Totally. Rav Hutner, I don't know, it's late, so I don't want to say this on. It's a very, very beautiful shtickle that Rav Hutner shares in the Sefer Zikaron, Pachid Yitzchak. But the critical importance of maintaining a sense of satisfaction in everyday, what's called average, everyday, run-of-the-mill ruchnius. I mean, we think about greatness and shifos for greatness, and we focus on big moments. We look forward to great moments of exaltation, great moments of accomplishment in Yiddishkeit and ruchnius. And Rav Hutner says it's a certain pressure that we have on ourselves over there. To always be on fire, and always be lit up, and always be pumped up, and always be growing, and always be moving. But sometimes when we think about those big moments, it come at the expense and it can cost us a sense of day-to-day satisfaction in the regular Tuesday mincha on the Rishon. Because we think about Purim. But really, life is more about Purim Kavod. We have Purim moments, which are awesome moments of Yichida, the greatest revelation of self, and those moments are beautiful and wonderful. We ought to look forward to those and aspire to them. But it's the day-to-day slugging it out, schlepping the water up the hill, choosing to be the simcha in the first other that really defines us more. And he calls it matzav b'li madregas, being in a state of not really being very high. Being in a state of not really acquiring or achieving anything in Yiddishkeit and Ruchnius. Being in a matzav of Yehudi b'li madregot, being just a person who's just in a regular everyday. Matzav b'li madregas. Hutner's Talmud Muvak, one of his Talmud Muvak was Shlomo Freifeld. Freifeld was once davening in Union City. He saw the Kloisenberger Rebbe, who again demands for greatness. He saw the Kloisenberger Rebbe. He saw the Rebbe before he davened. Before he davened, he was very careful. Before the Kloisenberger davened, he would always try to make mechadish something in tefillah. And then once he had this chiddush in tefillah, some new novel idea, the insight of davening, he would throw himself into prayers. And Rav Freifeld said, "Ooh, I like that." Rav Freifeld was the Rosh Hashiva in Shayasha, larger than life personality. It was just a charisma, fire, just a really, shoot from the hip, Talmud Chacham of a person, just had Rav Hutner's, sense of Gadol Sa'adam, self-confidence and recognition of greatness, and striving for greatness and demanding of others also. So he came back to the yeshiva with this new Kabbalah of like, I'm going to do what the Kloisenberger Rebbe did, and he gets there davening, and he's sitting there. Before he's going to daven, he's going to come up with some type of chiddush, and he was a creative thinker, and a lot of times we say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do it. It just couldn't get the engine going. Just couldn't get it going. And he sat there and he starts getting frustrated. He put pressure on himself. I got to have a chiddush. It wasn't organic. It was kind of, I got to come up with something because before I daven, I'm going to. And it didn't happen. And time went on, and time went on, and time went on. They started getting frustrated. And whatever expanded consciousness he hoped to achieve, he lost it. He was in a state of open decathlon, and he got frustrated. And they were starting to daven already. Now he was late to daven. Meaning, and he just said, forget, he got all frustrated. He told Talmidim that day, I realized that day two things. First of all, I'm not the Kloisenberger Rebbe. And second of all, what's good for the Kloisenberger Rebbe doesn't mean it has to be good for me. It's a good idea, It doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to attach my inspiration to it. To be simcha without trying to think that we have to push ourselves into a different state and acquire something and achieve something which is not necessarily organic for ourselves. Same with Rav Freifeld, the ones davening there in the base management Shayashuv, and the Chevra Talmidim are always watching their Rebbe. It's a thing, especially Talmidim in Shayashuv in those days, say in the late 70s, early 80s. A lot of Bali Tshuva, Chevra who were new, were watching him very carefully to see what does he do, how is he doing it. And they would ask him questions about it. So we saw that the Rav Freifeld was sitting there, like, put on his tefillin, with his shirt sleeve all rolled up, very big, towering, big figure, he's standing there. And he's standing there looking a little bit bothered, shook his head, he had a shalyad in his hand, there's holding his tefillin shalyad, and closed his eyes, shook his head back and forth, shook it off, like he's like a pitcher shaking off the catcher's signs, like, I'm not throwing a curveball. He shook it off a couple times, took a deep breath, paced back and forth a little bit, and then stopped, kind of took a deep breath, grew a couple inches, and then made the bracha and wrapped his tefillin shayat. Talmud came over and afterwards, when I left davening, he said, maybe I noticed the Rosh Shiva was busy in the beginning with shayat, stopped and knei or whatever, and looked, like what was going on there? Rav had smiled at him and said, no, it's actually, it's funny you mentioned. This morning I came into davening and I was tired and I just kind of locked in and jumped in without thinking, said the tefillah before putting on tefillin. I just was about to wrap my tefillin shayat and I stopped myself for a second. I said, what am I doing? Shalom, hello. I'm about to put on tefillin. The Gemara Brachos describes a story of Noam who came to the Smedrash, and so the Lord said, "Why are you so happy? Why are you smiling so much?" Rav Yirmiyah was excessively joyful, and Zera asks him, like, "What's going on, Rav Yirmiyah? Why are you so happy today?" And Rav Yirmiyah looks at him and says, "What do you mean? On a tefillin manach. I'm putting on tefillin. That's what do you mean? I'm putting on tefillin." Shlomo said to him, or Freifeld said, I caught myself for a moment there, about to put on tefillin, like just kind of throw it on, and I stopped myself and I said, hello, Shlomo Freifeld, you're a Jew. You're about to put on tefillin. On a tefillin manachman. It's a reason to stand up straight, to take a deep breath, and be besimcha. Fulfilling a commitment, my daily practice. I'm a Yid, I'm keeping Torah mitzvahs, on a tefillin manachman. So I had to stop for a second, reorient myself, and then put on my tefillin. After the war, one Purim, a couple of years after the war, in Union City, Kloisenberg Rebbe was in the middle of the Mishnah Purim, in the middle of the Suda, and he turned to one of the Talmidim. Now they had a system called Lifal Hashas, tests on like before Dirshu. Like before Dirshu was like flying around the world, with the Fleischmann Palace making 15-course meals in Vilna and Berlin and Tel Aviv and Paris and everything. It was just the Kloisenberg Rebbe counting Gemara, learning Gemara Behiyim, learning Gemara Bekiyas, ate Dappen by heart, or you weren't even Heaven. Very intense. And these guys would take tests, and they would have the tests before Purim, and the Rebbe would give money to the guys for passing tests, and knowing like Tosus in my heart. The Rebbe told me it was like the days before Purim were filled with pressure. So, and then the Brachim would come, and Purim was like really pumped, really exciting. Kabbalah Satar Ba'ava, after all these tests. So, Kloisenberg Rebbe, after a couple of cups of wine, turns to one of the guys and he says, "No, you're besimcha?" The guy says, "Yeah." He says, "You're besimcha. How many Tosos have you learned? You're besimcha. How many Dappen Gemara? How much Gemara you learned this year? Your Kabbalah Satar Ba'ava, you're besimcha?" So the guy says, "Yeah." The Kloisenberg Rebbe goes like this to him. He says, "You know why I'm besimcha today? Because I'm a Yid." Mordechai is called Ha-Yehudi. Simchas Purim comes from the tzaddik Mordechai, who's called Ha-Yehudi. So if a Yid wants to be besimcha, really, if we want to truly be besimcha Talmid, it's not because of our accomplishments, it's not because of our successes, it's not because of that. Mordechai HaTzadik. It's not Mordechai HaKadosh. Mordechai Ha-Yehudi. Recognizing that who we are is the source of our joy is what Purim is all about. It wasn't called Nasi, it wasn't called Gaon, simply Mordechai Yehudi. In fact, after Purim, Mordechai even has to move a couple seats back in the base of Medrash. He wasn't learning during that time, but he was an activist. He was Matsui L'Rov Achav. He didn't have, the biggest likes on Instagram or Facebook. He wasn't shared so many times. Wasn't the number one bestseller that Kufa. He saved the Jewish people. Mordechai. But Mordechai's sense of self, Mordechai's sense of joy, his sense of simcha sachar came from the fact that he was a Yid. That's what Kloisenberg Rebbe said. He said, I'm happy because I'm a Yid. Because my mother was Jewish, I'm Jewish, that's enough to be happy. Baruch Mordechai HaYehudi, that's the greatest title of all. These are days of avodah. The days of avodah. Like Rabbi Nachman said, the avodah of simcha is an avodah kasha of veda. It requires effort, it requires conscious choosing, conscious thinking. This simcha, like the Tzaddik says, is machshava, is a recognition, is a thought, is a consciousness, is a choice. We have the opportunity to choose. Maybe that we have good health, we have happiness. Maybe that we have people helping us schlep our buckets. Maybe we could even have a company that other people are stopping about this for us. To be revealed good, we should have good health and happiness and the fulfillment of all our heart's desires for good. And we should be zocheh to the Shnei Tamidin. Recognition that Hashem is always before us. That Hashem is before us constantly. Hashem is calling through us. And that everyone's Hashem will be zocheh to it. Allah Rishon, even if it's devoid of Torah mitzvahs, be a month that's filled with good, filled with simcha. And the more we commit ourselves, the more we dedicate ourselves, the more we contribute to the bigger picture of Yiddishkeit, God willing, we'll be able to draw forth the Shabbat mind, the Sons of the Raineh, Yeshua. And be zocheh, Ritz Hashem, to a time of Martin, the simcha, now and always. Goodbye.
Shekaya.